you want to leave your camera on, you can do that too.
Yes, please do. We love to see faces.
I love to see faces and reactions. Either way, you're comfortable, but yeah.
Yeah. And welcome to the June 11th presentation of the Alta Mesa Center for the Arts reading series. It's Pride Month, and we're just thrilled to host Lucy Jane Bledsoe, who we've hosted before on one of her earlier novels, and I think she just might be our resident fiction writer right now for the month of June, but also a tremendous inspiration to me as a novelist, and I think a lot of people probably in the room as well. Alta Mesa Center for the Arts is an interfaith arts and spirituality hub housed within and sponsored by Orinda Community Church. We believe that art is a spiritual act and a human right. We wish to provide a place where people from diverse traditions, artistic practices, and economic realities come together in community. We know that art can bridge divisions, substantive and arbitrary, that divide us. We come together not only to practice and teach the arts, but to celebrate and learn from our differences and to foster lively and respectful interdisciplinary dialogues. We seek unity in diversity. Wherever you are and whoever you are on your spiritual journey and your artistic journey, you are always welcome here. Lucy Jane Bledsoe is newest novel, Tell the Rest. Kirkus loved it. I loved it. It's described by Kirkus as a satisfying and nuanced story that tackles spirituality and spiritual abuse, offering connection and redemption. It offers all of those things, and I look forward to talking more about the book with Lucy in the next hour. Her other young adult novel, No Stopping Us Now, I think is a kind of a sister story to this story, is set in 1974 and 75 when Lucy was a high school athlete in Portland, fighting for the right to play. This interplay between writing and activism has probably always been part of Lucy's life, even though her literary chops stand for themselves. Lava Falls, a novel and a collection of stories set in the intersection of wilderness, family, and survival, won the 2019 Devil's Kitchen Fiction Award. Her novel, The Evolution of Love, was a finalist for another fabulous award and a Lambda Literary Award. She's, and by the way, if you read that book, just be careful driving across the Bay Bridge, because it's spooky to drive across the Bay Bridge after reading Evolution of Love. And if you've read it, you know why. Another favorite of mine is A Thin Bright Line and The Big Bang Symphony. She's received fellowships from the Yaddo Foundation, the California Council for the Arts, the Sunday Evening Post, and received the Great American Fiction Award. I could go on, but I know more than listening to this, we want to talk about this book and trying to introduce it and trying to think about what is it about the novel, beyond the fact that as an athlete myself, I found the story nested in a basketball team really compelling, was this quote from a man named Chad Hubach, who writes this: writers and athletes recognize their pursuits to be an apparently pointless affair, which sidesteps attempts to paraphrase its value, yet somehow seems to communicate something true or even crucial about the human condition. The human condition being basically that we are alive and have access to beauty, can even erratically create it. And I thought that quote might just be a good way to introduce this book and our shared obsessions with both sport and art. So I will introduce Lucy. Lucy will talk a bit about her book and read some, and then we will have a conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. I'm really happy to be here. I've loved my now several years long friendship and conversation with Mary, because we share so many of the same passions for why we write, including basketball and what that means. And we'll dig into that a little bit, because I always am afraid to tell people that I've written, I don't know why, but I've written 2 books in a row now that have basketball characters. And I know a lot of my friends are like, why basketball? And Mary is someone who understands why basketball. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. This book is, Tell the Rest is basically It was born from my rage at the Christian right, and what was happening. And I started writing it, and there's a scene in the book that I wrote from that place of rage, but I very quickly realized that I actually didn't want to spend, the 5 or 6 or 7 years it takes writing a novel living in that place of rage. That didn't seem very fun. So I started thinking about what I really wanted to write about, which was how, in the case of this book, the queer community fights back. And I think our most successful ways of doing that is through creativity. That quote Mary just read about art and finding ways. So one of my characters is a poet, and I use that to show how using creativity to deal with not just trauma, but how we're forming community and finding love and moving forward is so important. And community for me is really the basketball piece. I was, people often think I was probably a really great basketball player because I think about it and talk about it so much. I was not a particularly good basketball player. Even in high school, I didn't start. I think I was the 6th person. I was the first one off the bench, but I wasn't that great. And that was back when we didn't even have programs. I mean, now I would probably never come close to the team, but I loved team sports because it was the sisterhood. It was this community of young women who were working together towards excellence, who had a commitment to achieving goals together in this way that was kind of askance, which was beautiful because these my friendships, most of my close friendships today are from my college basketball teams from high school, and from my basketball teams from both high school and college, and just the commitments that we formed and the conversations we had meant so much to me. So I wanted to have another one of the characters in this book be a basketball coach who deals with, she's 38, but she's dealing with young women on high school and college teams and dealing with that whole issue of what it means to be a community and work together and to overcome. Each of the girls on the team is having her own trauma and working together to overcome that. So Tell the Rest is the story of Delia, a 38-year-old college basketball coach, and Ernest, a 41-year-old poet. And also a third character, Cal, I would call him a ghost boy, who's also an important character in the novel. And 25 years ago, these 3 friends met at a Christian conversion therapy camp. And Delia and Ernest, the poet and the basketball coach, well, they were just kids at the time, when they were 13 and 16, they escaped the camp together. And the novel is about the impact of that camp experience on the 3 kids, but importantly on how the power of friendship and community and creativity overrides and heals the trauma that they went through. So most of the book takes place actually when these survivors are adults, living happy and relatively successful lives. But there's some flashbacks to the camp experience too, to put a context on what they're trying to deal with now, 25 years later after that experience.
And each of them too, Delia comes back to her small Oregon town after having lived far away. And in this homecoming, doesn't just return to a place, but seems to return to all those memories that she escaped in some ways in the game, but also when she left for college.
Yeah, no, that's true. Both of these characters left Oregon. It takes place when I said it well, that's a whole nother story. We can talk about the happiness studies thing a little later. But anyway, I did it in Oregon because I'm from Oregon, but also because I just think beauty is a really important healing factor, and Oregon's so beautiful. But yes, both of these, the poet lives in Brooklyn, New York now, and the basketball coach was on at a Sean, you just mentioned Williams. I don't call it Williams, but it's a small Ivy League college on the East Coast. And the basketball character, Delia, she's been fired and her wife has left her. So she ends up coming back to Oregon, where she went to high school. And Ernest, the poet, gets a job at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. So they're both at the same time brought back to Oregon, where they had this experience together. And throughout the novel, their paths are coming closer and closer together and finding each other again in the friendship they shared way back then.
Yeah. Well, is there a section in that, maybe a flashback section that finds them both together, just to give us a taste of the novel and that friendship?
Yeah. I want to read the section where they first meet. One thing, I did a whole lot of research about conversion therapy and what happens. And one thing that really interested me was how in most of the cases for most of these young people, and it's not always young people, but it's mostly young people because they're vulnerable and are targeted by these people who do this. They they know at the time they're going through the conversion therapy experience that it's nuts, that it doesn't make sense. And yet they go through it because they're kids. And, when you're 13, 14, 15, you kind of, you don't really know how to take control of your own life. You have nowhere else to go. A lot of them talk about, in the interviews that I did with them, or read the interviews or listened to videos of interviews, they talk about the fear of losing the only community they had ever known, which is their church community or their family. The fear of going to hell. On one hand, they know that's nuts. There's no such thing as hell. I'm not going to hell. The love I feel for my friend here is one of the most beautiful spiritual things I know. And yet at the same time, they're too young to be able to separate from the fears. So in this scene, when the kids meet, you'll see some of that awareness. And this is Delia. She's just been sent to this camp, and she thinks it's a regular Christian camp that she's been sent to. She doesn't quite understand where she's been sent yet. She's young. She's only 13. She's been shown that they're going to have boating and archery and arts and crafts, and she's kind of excited to be there. Best of all, though, this is her thinking, were the other campers. It was as if someone had gathered all the quirky, expressive kids and left behind the terrifyingly ordinary ones. One girl could name every plant she saw, including the tiny mosses and lichens. One boy did perfect imitations of celebrity dance steps, including some by a dead guy named Fred Astaire. For about a day and a half before she caught on, Delia thought she'd landed in a magical place. And that first night, with a flashlight under the covers of her sleeping bag, she used a piece of the stationery which she'd brought to write Shauna, and to instead write a note thanking Pastor Quaid for giving her this chance, the scholarship. She had been told she's a scholarship person at the camp. The next day at breakfast, Delia asked the counselor, Maureen, to please mail the letter. The counselor told her that campers weren't allowed to send or receive mail, and that struck Delia as strange. But Celebration Camp had a sealed feeling, a secret garden kind of vibe, and so it made a funny kind of sense. Anyway, Maureen kept the letter, put it in her back pocket. Maybe she'd break the rule for Delia this time. After all, the letter was just to her pastor. That morning after chores, the campers gathered in the dining hall for dating lessons. This too surprised Delia. She'd gone to a couple of school dances and it had been fine. She'd like to dance. Her brother Dylan and his girlfriend were already dating by then, and they just sort of hung out. Delia hadn't been aware of any protocols or rules for dating. It was interesting, though, the idea that there was something she needed to learn about dating. Why not, she thought. She felt pleasantly curious as she took her seat at the class. Pastor Bob and Maureen checked campers off a list to make sure everyone was in attendance. The scary-looking counselor, Malcolm, with his hollow cheeks and sharp, jutting jawline, stood to the side, hands clasped behind his back. Though they were indoors, he hadn't removed his sunglasses. Hey, Delia Barnes, Maureen called out. Come on over here. She stood next to Pastor Bob at a distance from the campers, and Delia went, still feeling special, selected, a scholarship recipient. I'm thinking we could send Delia over to crafts, Maureen said to Pastor Bob. Wade is there. He could do a project with her. Pastor Bob looked annoyed. Why? She's only 13, Maureen said this extra quietly as if it was a mistake. Pastor Bob, who was a couple of inches shorter than Delia, looked up at her face. Oh, I think our girl can handle a bit of dating advice. What do you say, Delia? Sure. Yeah. Good girl, he said, and turning to Maureen, he added, that's why she's here. She's young as all, Maureen said. Young, and according to Pastor Quaid, already active. Maureen nodded her acquiescence. Take your seat, Pastor Bob said. Maureen gave Delia a confusing smile with her thin lips zipped tight. She looked both vexed and sympathetic. It was the jarring dissonance in that smile that first tipped Delia off to something being awry at this camp. But the dating lesson was kind of fun. In the first role-playing exercise, the boy asked the girl out, and the girl needed to use the appropriate amount of eye contact, very little, but enough, and words to accept or reject, depending on several factors, but mainly on whether or not he was a Christian. That made the game easy. If he was, you said yes. If he wasn't, you said no. You looked him in the face briefly when he began speaking to you, but then for the sake of modesty, you stared down at your own knees for most of the encounter because boys don't like aggressive girls. If the boy exhibited questionable behaviors, Pastor Bob's phrase, but he was a Christian, This was a great deal for the girl. It was an opportunity. Girls, Pastor Bob explained, have a lot of responsibility to use their wiles, again, his word, to make boys and men better Christians. In the next exercise, the campers sat side by side on hard chairs, stand-ins for movie theater or car seats to practice conversation. Delia got paired with a tall boy named Ernest, one of only 2 Black kids at the camp. At the beginning of the class, Pastor Bob told the whole group that Delia's height, the way she towered over most of the boys, would only exacerbate their already triggered feelings of masculine inadequacy. His need to explain gave the impression that the match, despite the height fit, had problems. And Delia understood his discomfort had to do with their skin color differences. She heard Ernest huff quietly. Throughout the start of the morning, as other couples performed in front of the group, Delia snuck looks at her assigned partner. Finally, he whipped his head around and widened his eyes. Keeping his hands in his lap and the gesture minuscule, he spread his fingers in a "what" gesture. Delia smiled, raised her hand, and waved, even though she was sitting right next to him. He stared at her for a second before relaxing his shoulders and silently laughing. "You're a trip," he whispered. "Where are you from?" "Rockside," she said. "Rock where?" "On the coast." "Which coast?" "Oregon coast." "Poor child," he said. "Why, where are you from?" "Los fucking Angeles, where the ground is properly covered with pavement and buildings." Delia laughed and forgot to do it quietly. "Delia," Maureen scolded, "pay attention." Ernest widened his eyes at her again and whispered, "Girl, subterfuge, please, subterfuge." She didn't know what that word meant, but she liked her date. Ernest's ears and feet were too big for the rest of his body, giving him a sweetly mismatched appearance. She'd already noticed his tendency to stumble. This morning, he wore a t-shirt and khaki shorts, and the skin on his long arms and legs looked soft, as if he used lotion religiously. When their turn came, both kids strived to ace the exercise, using the proper body and verbal language, making sure they followed the guidelines. But then, right after they'd been dismissed and Pastor Bob called up another pair, Ernest bowed to her and said too quietly for anyone else to hear, "Enchanted, I'm sure, darling." And Delia knew he was mocking the training. Delia held up her arm and made a muscle. "Girl," he said, still quietly, but with lots of feeling. At the break, the kids all spilled out of the dining hall and met in clusters on the edge of the meadow. Delia followed Ernest into the cool yellow sunshine. He stopped to talk to a thin, much shorter, ultra-pale boy with red-rimmed eyes. His white blonde hair had recently been sheared into a crew cut so that the upper part of his scrawny neck was even whiter than the rest of his skin, showing where his hair had recently hung longer and freer. He wore a red plaid flannel shirt and stiff new Levi's, both a size too big. The outfit looked like a straitjacket on the delicate kid. As she approached the 2 boys, a light breeze shook the alders surrounding the dining hall building, the green leaves fluttering nervously. "Hi," the pale boy said to her. "Meet my girlfriend," Ernest said, blinking his eyelashes in mock femininity. "Delia." "You present so straight," the other boy said, looking Delia up and down. He sure didn't present straight. His prettiness burst out of the plaid shirt and rugged jeans. "Straight?" Ernest swatted the ridiculous term away. "You got to be kidding me. This girl's an Amazon, am I right?" The boys waited for an answer. She looked away, pretended to be interested in what the other kids were doing. She wanted to ask what an Amazon was, but she knew, all at once she knew, these kids were all queer, homos. I'm going to stop there. But that's when the 3 kids in the center of the story meet.
Yeah, that the dialogue is wonderful throughout. I thought that the back and forth dialogue just captured both the awkwardness of any situation, but also a great deal of humor, even in a very dark, a dark scene.
I appreciate you saying there's humor. I was nervous about this book that people would think it was going to be too depressing, and it's really not very depressing, but it does take on an intense topic.
It is intense, but I think, you know, the Ernest, we meet Ernest later. Ernest comes back into the book in I think chapter 3 or 4. And we realize that these 2 people who had met very briefly in this very intense situation are now going to meet again. And that's part of what propels us forward in the book, but also the humor. Can you share with us the cat's name, Ernest's adopted cat?
Well, Ernest is house sitting when he got his job at Lewis and Clark College. He house sits the professor's place, and there's a cat there named Virginia Woolf. and he was instructed to only ever call the cat Virginia Woolf, not Virginia. So in a longer story than I can exactly tell here, he ends up adopting another cat, and he names her Audre Lorde. So now he has two cats, Virginia Woolf and Audre Lorde.
We were opinionated and quite large characters throughout.
Yeah.
But it struck me too when you were talking about coming from a place of rage, because we talked about that briefly last week, but it seems that Delia also has a similar arc where she begins the book in a place of rage, but can't maintain that and become the coach of these girls throughout. Did you find yourself mirroring her transformation as you wrote the book too?
Yes, I mean, I wanted to write a character who was experiencing the rage that I felt, and my rage doesn't come from I wasn't submitted to conversion therapy, but I have to say, I feel like just listening to the likes of Ron DeSantis and all of these people on a daily basis now is an emotional violence I feel every day, and it's all on a continuum. Just having to listen to these people on TV, of course, is not the same of having been sent to a camp when I was a teen, but it's all part of the same thing. It's an emotional violence, and it's a hatred, and I was so sick of it. And so that's actually why I went to the conversion therapy. I thought, let me just go to the belly of the beast. Let me just go to this most heinous thing these people are doing, and tackle it. So my character, I mean, that's part of the humor, I think. It's some of the ways that the Delia character expresses her rage in the beginning. And she does work through it through some means that, I feel like I used to work through mine. For me, writing the novel helped me work through it. I mean, I don't feel that at all so much having that. I mean, that's one of the joys of writing fiction, is you get to take things that are concerning to you or that you're feeling and give them to your characters and work them out that way. And I also loved, as I said before, the Ernest character, who's a poet. I mean, he's been dealing with the trauma of and he's not turned his back entirely on his faith either, in the way Delia has. So he's trying to deal with all of this through poetry, which is just something I love to think about, how creativity and art of all kinds is a way to deal with the hardest things that we have to struggle with.
Yeah, and yet he struggles too. At the very beginning of this book, he cannot and write the poem that he knows is there about the experience. And it seems like he's been holding this poem his whole life.
Well, for him, I mean, I wondered, was this going to be enough of a trajectory to interest readers? But it is sort of the suspense for him. He's wanted to write this poem for 25 years and hasn't been able to write this poem about what happened to him and Delia and their escape and what happened during the escape. So yes, that's he's hoping once he's back in Oregon, he can do it, but he's not succeeding very well.
Well, it seems to that part of the escape is the return. They could not escape until they both physically returned to the place of this trauma too at different times during the book.
They do. Ernest's boyfriend talks him into going to actually, Ernest's boyfriend Googles and finds where the camp was. And Ernest is like, you're not doing this. You are, and talks him into going. So he goes on his own back to the camp. And eventually, well, I don't know. Am I giving away too much to say eventually? I don't think it's giving away. Ernest and Delia go back together, which is kind of,
yeah. And that return is well, they've never really left. I mean, their minds and their their bodies hold the experience of this trauma their whole lives too. Yeah. And it's funny, you talk about the rage and the ways in which Delia expresses rage. It involves oranges
yes.
in supermarkets. Yes. But it's interesting to see the times when she just loses control of her emotions seem to correspond with the times when she loses control over this wall that she's put between the past and the present.
Yeah, I mean, the first scene I probably wrote, and I'm going to preface telling this story by, I meant to say at the beginning, thank you to the Alta Mesa Center for the Arts for hosting this, and also Arenda Community Church. And one of the things I was really hoping to do with this novel was to have some dialogue with some churches and Christians and folks who are on the Christian left, as opposed to the Christian right, which, there's a huge difference. So anyway, I just wanted to preface this story. But one of the places where she first, the rage scene that I opened sort of my writing process with was she goes back to her old high school because it's the only place she could get a job based on losing her temper at her college job, which is a whole nother thing. And she sees a high school boy seriously harass a queer kid in the school. The first moment Delia walks in the school, she sees this guy harassing this kid, and she loses her temper and throws him against a locker. Oh, and the part I wanted to mention is she also sees that he has a cross around his neck, and that just sort of triggers, all the memories and makes her really angry. So that was where I started writing this, but she develops way beyond that.
Yeah, well, and also to the very place, the church that she had attended, now she makes her own assumptions about the pastor, whoever it is who's now officiating that place. So did your relationship to the Christian left change as you were writing the book? Or had you always had a knowledge of the openness and love that exists?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it changed. I mean, I actually majored in religious studies and did my thesis on some of the leftist Christianity that was happening in Central America. And so I have a cousin who's a very leftist, inclusive, compassionate pastor. So no, I don't feel like that's new information, but it was something I wanted to share. But the character you're talking about came in very late in the process of writing. There is a character, and I don't know, I think you meet her maybe halfway through the book, who is in fact, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but in fact, she is a incredibly open, compassionate, inclusive pastor. And so she totally throws my character Delia off, who's used to, from the church she was brought up in, these sort of horrendous people who betrayed her. So she has to deal with this. Delia, my character, has to deal with this character she meets. And that was I feel like that was a breakthrough in writing the book. It was like, yeah, one of the things I want to say is the Christian right is neither. They're neither Christian. They're so not Christian, and they're not right. So I wanted to be able to show that, this wasn't a book ranting against a religion or Christianity. In fact, it's the opposite. I mean, actual Christianity is a beautiful thing. It's just the people who have a voice in this country and claiming that religion are so heinous and are not practicing what I see as Christianity.
Yeah. And the notion of love is the foundation too. And she seems to learn a great deal about her own closed-mindedness just by coming into contact with these teenage girls. And I'm trying to find a spot that's perfect for reading about her relationship to the girls. Do you have a favorite section of that that highlights her interactions?
Oh, that's a good question. There's 12 girls on a basketball team typically. I don't have every single one of them having, but there's at least 3 of them who are going through some pretty traumatic stuff in their lives. And I played with the idea of, I love how coaches sort of are stand-ins for therapists and parents and all of these things, and yet they're not any of that at the same time. So they all, one by one, she has to deal with some of the things that's going on with these girls and trying to, and since she had coached college before, now this is high school, she has to be much more careful in how she, deals with things like, I guess that would give it away if I told one of the girls' traumas. So I don't have a particular scene. I think one thing, and I know a lot of people who work with kids, and so I have a scene that I do like where she's dealing with one of the girls' fathers who's accusing her of, because his kid's not, accusing her of several things. He's pissed off that her team is diverse, and his daughter's not on the team. And so, yeah, it's just playing with those different kinds of relationships that I know from teams that happen.
That's pretty early in the book. That's before she's chosen, or at least put the team up on the board. What was that name? It was, I had it all marked out here.
The name of that father?
Yeah.
Let's see. I think I have a tab somewhere in there on that one.
My son upset my neatly tagged
Whoops.
book about 5 minutes before we got on. Well, we can come back to that too, but I was curious about now, having been an athlete most of my life. And I know that you too consider sport and movement in the body a spiritual expression. What is it about gyms? I call gyms sacred. When I go into a gym and I hear the bounce of the ball, empty gym especially, when there's no one else there but me, and this pursuit that again seems senseless, there's a feeling that comes over me that's very like coming into an empty church.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what your notion is of what a sacred space is. And does that space, do we too narrowly define what that space is?
I think for me, yeah, what is a sacred space? I don't know if I can answer that, but I can speak to the gym being a sanctuary in a way. At least it was for me as a kid. I mean, it started out not being, because it was where I loved going to the gym, but we would go, pretty much every night. We were either at a baseball field or a gym watching my brother's games, basketball or baseball, but I didn't get to play because there weren't teams for girls in Oregon in the 1960s. But when I eventually did get to play, I found out ways to play. And there was the thing about just leaving my mind behind and just completely inhabiting my physical self. And yeah, the dance of working in concert with other people that way. I just loved it. And I mean, there's a whole thing about endorphins that, it's like, there's a thing with cycling. I'm a big cyclist, called LSD, long steady distance. And it's true. There's just this high you get from the endorphins, and from, I think it's maybe that intense focus. You get to let go of everything else, and you have this one idea that, you with your teammates, you're trying to put that orange ball into that net. And it seems so, I know to a lot of people, it seems so frivolous, but when you get deep into it, it is deep. It's actually a deep thing. And you go to this place and you learn so much about yourself. I found my voice through sport because I got in touch with my body. I mean, and being healthy and caring about being fit actually helped me find my mind at the same time.
That is fascinating. I've been speaking to a lot of people about embodied spirituality, both dancers and athletes, but what this means and how we can translate what has often been cribbed into words into a full body experience. And the only time I've ever experienced this is when I'm sweating and relatively uncomfortable for a while, until there's something that transcends that discomfort.
Just breaks through. I mean, that thing when you get in the zone, playing basketball, it's just like, it's a beautiful thing. It's like you didn't know your body could do that. You just, like, everything becomes fluid, and there's a spiritual component to it for sure.
Do you feel that as well in the writing? Do you feel like that's a space you can inhabit?
Definitely. I mean, when the writing's going well, and it hasn't for the last 2 months, but that's another story. When it's going well, you can just get into this place where, I mean, I have no idea where the ideas come from when they do come. And yeah, I love that. And the idea, and it is, I mean, maybe this is hokey, but you do feel a little bit like you're on a team with your characters, I mean, there you are, and you're like trying to bring them to life and help them shine and tell their story. And, yeah, it's I don't know how that happens. It's a little bit like dreaming. I mean, when we dream, these whole like narratives just stream through your mind while you're asleep. I don't even know how that happens. You see people in your dreams that you've never talked to in years. And same thing with writing. It's like, I didn't decide to have this idea. It just like comes through the characters. And I'm not very woo-woo either. So, I'm not saying this. Mary, I did find this scene. This isn't spiritual at all, but I did find this scene where that father.
Oh, great.
Girl,
Is it page 58? Because I think I just found it.
Yeah, it starts at the bottom.
Sorry about that.
Do you want me to read that?
Oh, please. Yeah, that's a great scene.
About 4 minutes long. So she's just finished. They had tryouts. She named who her team was. It was really hard figuring out everyone else. And they've just finished a practice. So as the girls emerged from the locker room, these are high school girls, and joined their parents and left the gym, Delia mopped up the puddles from the water fight and gathered the stray basketballs. When at last she was alone, she allowed herself a whoop of satisfaction. Day 1 of practice went very well. She grabbed a ball off the rack and launched a 40-foot shot. It hit the front iron and ricocheted back into her hands. She was about to shoot again when she heard the clunk and clang of someone's heavy feet descending from the top of the bleachers. She turned, ball still aloft in her hands, to see a man, white, 50-ish, with graying hair at his temples and a round top belly, jump from the last bleacher onto the court. "I hear you played for Tennessee," he said. "I did, a few years ago, though," as if she had to explain that missed shot. "How'd you like Summit?" This, for those of you who don't know, Pat Summit's a very famous basketball coach who coached at Tennessee. This guy says, "Heard she was quite the taskmaster." Delia didn't respond to the comment that didn't feel like a compliment. "And you coached at Monroe College for the last few years," he said. "Yep," she says, "I'm Delia Barnes, and you are?" "Mike Foster, Alice's dad." Delia says, "I'm sorry I can't carry more girls on the team." Alice Foster was the fourth senior Jonas had mentioned, and it had been radical to cut her since she played on the team last 2 years, but it hadn't been a hard decision. She had been so lackadaisical, pushing indolent during all 5 days of tryouts that Delia became convinced she didn't want to be on the team. She had almost asked the kid why she bothered trying out, but decided the less said, the better. "So," Mike Foster says, "this is like an affirmative action kind of thing?" Delia understood that an attack was coming. She had fielded this one at Monroe. There was always one parent who resented a student of color making the team instead of, or getting more playtime than, their daughter. "I'm sorry," she said, and then regretted the words because she wasn't at all sorry about her team choices, only that he was disappointed and that she couldn't help him. "I'm not prejudiced," he said, "but the demographics of this town are white. You even managed to get a Chinese girl on your team." "Well, obviously the demographics of this team aren't all white," she said, "as evidenced by my team. And by the way, Brittany is Vietnamese." "You have 13 girls on the team," he said. "That's atypical. How'd you choose?" He cocked his head to the side. She didn't like the bad luck number either, but her team selection was none of his business. "Look," he said, not waiting for her to answer, "you're just getting started, so maybe you don't completely understand. Actually," she said, "I've coached for 12 years. I mean here in Rockside." Delia smiled to contain her anger. "I grew up here," she said. "I definitely understand Rockside." "Sure, I remember you. In fact, my family's hardware store sponsored some of your team's travel, but you've been away. A lot has changed." "No doubt," she said. "You've got the 2 Indian girls," he said. "You got the Mexican. Okay, the Oriental girl. The Vlasak Jones kid can't even play. Why is she on the team?" "Her name is Mickey," Delia said. "She could be trouble if someone decided to challenge her gender." "Why would they do that?" "Fair is fair. Male home runs would give her an edge," he said. Delia considered her possible responses. One, pointing out that he had no idea what hormones existed in Mickey's body, nor that it was any of his business. 2, pointing out that he himself had just used a female pronoun for her. 3, pointing out that if she, quote, "can't even play," then clearly she didn't have any kind of edge over the other players. She simply said, "Again, I'm sorry that you're disappointed in my choices, but," he interrupted, "her mother is the city manager, real pushy gal, forever telling people how to live their lives, like what to do with their trash or what language is allowed at city council meetings. The husband is a sculptor." He spoke the last word the same way you'd say scoundrel. "I'm just coaching a basketball team, Mr. Foster." "Mike," he said. She didn't really want to be on a first name basis with him, but murmured, "Mike." "I don't like it," he said. "The numbers don't work out." "Oh, you mean carrying 13 players? She knew that wasn't what he meant. He meant, quote unquote, demographics, but maybe she could steer him onto common ground. "I hope no one quits," she said, "but it's likely. We'll have 12 players then, if not fewer. These first weeks are going to be challenging for some of the girls." Mike Foster hadn't smiled once, but he'd been listening, and it occurred to Delia that he seemed more baffled than angry. That didn't stop him from staying on the offense, though. "Why'd you leave Maroon College?" he asked. "Seems like a step down from college to high school." Her palms and soles started tingling, that new heat under her skin the way it flamed without notice. Diplomacy was 50% of her job. She absolutely couldn't afford to blow it again. "Uncomfortable question?" he asked. She squeezed the basketball between the heels of her hands. What if she just answered honestly? What if she just said, "My wife left me for a tenured women's studies professor. The college fired me for losing my temper, and Rockside, Oregon is my last resort." That's that scene. Thank you for listening. I've never read that scene out loud before.
Oh,
Spoken to an audience, so yeah.
he's a great character, and he means well.
Well, you
He
know,
wants to get his daughter on the team.
wants to get his daughter on the team. One of the challenges of writing fiction is, or for me, one of the biggest challenges is my evil characters or my unpleasant characters is to make them real. And so,
Mm.
then, I mean, in human life, I'm just like any other human, judgmental, snarky person. But when I'm writing fiction, I try to, as much as I can, find the good in every person. It's just part of the challenge of writing fiction, and it makes it fun. It makes the characters better. So with him, he's a pretty unpleasant guy, as you can see. But, and I have a little sentence in there that starts to hint at it. He does actually listen. And
Mm.
so he has his own small arc that's helped by the girls, giving him some insight into his um, false ideas. But anyway, so that he was a fun character to write to. And he was also, that came late because I just had him just being a jerk. And then I thought, you know, let me just see if I can give him one quality. So the one quality is he actually listens sometimes. And I guess I think he changes a little bit.
He does in a very small but believable and satisfying way throughout. But you'll all have to read the book to find out what way that is. We have time for questions from the audience as well. So if you want to come off mute, or if you want to put your questions into the text, into the chat, I'm happy to give voice to those.
I would love to hear your questions. I know someone has one.
If not, I have a list, but I'll let the awkward silence last for another minute.
Sometimes I have my own questions for myself, and then that gets the ball rolling. It's
Well,
harder.
what question do you have?
Well, I didn't do it this time.
Oh.
Sometimes I come up with a question or two. Yeah.
Sarah has a question.
Oh, okay, go.
Oh, Sarah asks, what was the biggest surprises doing this research for this book?
Oh, that's a really good question. The two biggest surprises were the one I already mentioned, to find that a lot, I imagined these kids just tortured and miserable, and they are tortured and miserable. And it is true that suicide rates are much higher among young people who have been put through conversion therapy. So it is horrible, but that part of learning that so many of them understand, even while they're going through it, that it's wrong and it's just nuts. And there's a woman who is a city council person. I think her name is Patty Sheehan, city council person in I don't think it's Miami, Florida, but Orlando, Florida. That's right. And she's a councilwoman now. So she's obviously moved forward in her life. And she talks about going through conversion therapy and having, I guess it sounded like 2 or 3 pastors around her, you know, yelling at her and telling her to let the devil out. And these guys told her that the evil of her homosexuality would leave her body in the form of an orange mucus. And she's a teenager, and she's like, you know, are these guys out of their minds? They literally told her, like, this is not that long ago, that it was going to leave her body in the form of an orange mucus. So she knew it was nuts, but she still didn't know how to get out of the situation. So, I mean, that surprised me a lot. And it shouldn't have, because kids and teens are so aware and so smart, and that happens in so many ways with them. The other thing that surprised me was how many of these young people, not all of them, but how many have stayed in the church. You know, I just assumed everyone who's been through this experience would say, I am out of here, you know, and a major FU to Christianity and the whole church. And that's not the case. A whole lot of them, in fact, keep their faith and find other churches that support them and love them and include them. So that was interesting to me, and kind of cool. I mean, this, you know, that again, just trusting young people to find their path through hard stuff and go where they want to go.
Mary asks a similar question about the details of the conversion therapy. Like, how did you find that? You had the city council person that you found an interview, but what other sources did you have?
I had a number of sources. I did a whole lot of reading books. It just so happens that my agent's best friend went through it. So there's a lot of people I could talk to, but I would say the very best source, and if anyone's interested in listening to these, there's a wonderful website called Born Perfect. Actually, it's the organization called Born Perfect. And the organization exists for the sole purpose of combating conversion therapy. And they're wonderful people. I did an event with one of their lawyers actually a couple months ago. And they research who are practitioners. There's 700,000 people in this country today who have been through conversion therapy. It's many more than you think. My book takes place in the state of Oregon, and there are today, right now, 59 practitioners doing conversion therapy as we speak. That's mainly mental health professionals, and churches and pastors are the main people doing it. But you don't need a license, you don't need anything anyone can do it. So I could do it, you could do it. We wouldn't, of course. But so this organization, Born Perfect, tracks these people, and it finds people, mainly I think people come to them and sort of out these evildoers, as I'm going to call them, and they keep track of them and try to educate them. Anyway, they have a website. I think it's bornperfect.org, and there must be 25 videos on there of survivors of conversion therapy telling their stories, and they're wonderful. So you can just listen to people talk about what they went through and how they're feeling now and what it was like and what they experienced. And that was just a wealth of information, and both the statistics and to see how prevalent it was and is, and also to hear how people experienced it.
Piggybacking off those two questions, you did research into happiness studies.
Oh, yes.
And I'm remembering the character, was it Robin?
Yes.
The philosopher janitor who has this whole notion of what it means to be happy. On mine, it's on page 139. And I just found him delightful and surprising. And he just popped up in the middle of that book when I think both Delia and I needed him most.
Yeah. And yeah, I love that character too. And he came on pretty early in my conceiving of this book. And again, it was the part where I really didn't want to spend, a few years of my life thinking about rage, and I didn't want to write trauma porn. I wanted to write about what it means to build a life that's productive and creative and helpful, and where people connect via love and friendship. So I just dug into, I had in the past before also just read books about what makes people happy. And there is literally people who get, degrees in happiness studies. And it's really wonderful to read that stuff. So I made the janitor at the high school someone who had almost gotten his PhD in happiness studies or in philosophy, but focusing on happiness. And it turns out that he actually was in high school with my character Delia back when they were kids at that high school together. And so they reconnect as friends, and he tells her what he's learned about happiness. And it ties in for me really well with the book, because there's things like biophilia, and which is being in beautiful places. And I totally relate to that one. I mean, it just helps my happiness so much to be in beautiful places, which is why I love Oregon. Doing things like helping others, we all know that contributes to happiness. What else does he list? Oh, I have him here. That's right. Doing creative work is definitely a happiness factor, and that's one reason I made Ernest a poet. One thing that was one really big factor in what helps make people happy is being a part of a community. And so that really tied in with both that I'm writing about church communities and congregations and teams. So I wanted to play with how that works and how people found happiness in congregations and churches, and also via teams, and how are they alike and how are they different. And so, yeah, so it was really fun having that character and using him to play with some of these ideas. And that's a little risky in writing a novel. I know that those of you here who are novelists, actually using a character for a vehicle for getting ideas across. And I just kind of did with him, but I hope it works.
Yeah. Oh, I loved him. And he's a kind of a guy who almost always says more than he intends, but is kind of aware at this mid-sentence too. And just the observation of that character trait was just wonderful. Sean says there's ornithotherapy practiced by bird watching. And that list, I wonder too. So number one is bibliophilia, belonging to a beautiful place, taking care of others, doing creative work. But also what Sean's comment makes me think of, just an obsession that takes you out of yourself and into something larger.
Absolutely. And Sean, there is a bird watcher a bird, yeah, in this book, but just she has a small role, but she's there. Yeah, I mean, one thing that interested me in reading about happiness studies is two important ones were being a trusting person and having hope. And as my character points out, those are frustrating because there's no action you can't just have hope. You can't just, if you're not a trusting person, you can't make yourself trust. So my janitor philosopher, talks about that, how they're not, they're not actionable paths towards happiness. So they're not as helpful as others. But I mean, it is true, I think, if you have hope, you're more happy. But how can you just have hope,
No, that is a good question, especially now with what's going on nationally. This book gives me hope. The book gives me hope that I'm going to learn, and it makes me think about the importance of books generally to take us to places and into minds and into landscapes we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And that the threat to our reading freedoms concerns me very much.
Yes, very, very much. Yeah, I mean, I think fiction is all about compassion and finding out and learning about other, either sharing your own story or learning about other people's stories while reading. I mean, there's nothing that does that better than fiction. And just reading other people's stories. What can be better than that in terms of, finding out what other people are thinking and feeling?
And Sarah has another question. Do you want to just unmute, Sarah, and join us?
Yes, I mean, first I just want to say it was gorgeous. It's always gorgeous reading your work and hearing you read. And I just really appreciate how many new people you bring into our lives and imagination, and you bring them to life and then they sort of exist forever. So I was wondering, are there characters in this book or any of them that you have trouble letting go of, or you imagine going back to? Are there people who are still calling to you in some way?
That's a good question. I don't usually fantasize about doing sequels per se, but I do feel like, and if you've read the book, I mean, Cal, I miss him a little bit because we didn't get enough of him, as Ernest and Delia miss him, because he's gone for so much of the book. So I wish I could have spent more time with him. Although I like, you fiction writers, I broke a great big rule at the end of the book in terms of how I deal with his story. And I fully expected my agent to say, you can't do that. And she didn't say that. And then I fully expected my editor, the publisher, to say, you can't do that. And no one said that. So I got to have the Cal piece at the end, which you'll see if you read the book. That's just breaks a fiction writing rule. But
although Cal hovers over the story from the very beginning, when they all meet at that conversion.
That's why I call him a ghost boy in the story, because he's there all the time, but he's not on the page very much. And so we don't get to hear him talk, and we don't really get to see the fullness of his, with Ernest and Delia, we really see the fullness to what happened between their teen years at the camp and as they are adults now I think they're 38 and 41 years old. And we just get we don't get to see fully what happened to Cal.
Yeah, but he lived, and he's living. And that was one of the things I appreciated about his reappearance later. That's it. That gives me hope.
I would say that's a big spoiler, but as someone who doesn't mind spoilers, because I don't usually read for suspense anyway.
It's not. You'll love it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Oh, well, you're going to love the book anyway. But I
shouldn't have said that.
No, he's a great character because he carries all of these characters carry both rage and hope and love all in the same person, and they give voice to them in various ways on the basketball court or in the gym, in the janitorial space below. Robin's a chess coach, which I think is great too. There's coaches all through this book, quiet and insistent both. But I want to give Lucy just a huge round of applause, both virtual or otherwise. You can go ahead and take your mute off for just being the writer that she is, the visionary that she is. I do think that fiction can heal in ways that a lot of different kinds of art try to, but it does it very efficiently. Well, how efficient is it to write a novel, actually, the novelists in the room?
Yes.
It's like making dinner. You eat it efficiently. You don't make it efficiently. I also want to let you know about our next reading on July 9th with an author named Nina Schuyler, who's written a remarkable book called Afterwards. And it's a book that takes on another very difficult and relevant topic of AI and what is our place, what is the human cost, what is the human response to this new technology. And it's a delight. You can get it into books or order it online. We are going to go off recording, but we will still be here. So if you have any lingering questions, I want to thank you all for coming. I hope that you come back and read on, keep reading. It's a human, it's a public service. Keep reading.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I really appreciated
Thank
seeing
you.
all old friends and new ones. Thank you so much.